I'd like to introduce Professor Safatle, who's titular professor at the Department of Philosophy at the University of São Paulo. He's been invited to Paris, 7, 8, Toulouse, where he is now, Louvain, Essex, Stellenbosch, and has been a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley. He's the author of books on critical theory, psychoanalysis, political philosophy, and the dialectical tradition. Among others, the Grand Hotel Abyss, subtitle Desire, Recognition, and the Restoration of the Subject, and that came out in 2016 with the University of Leuven Press. He is also responsible for a new edition of Adorno's work in Portuguese. So please join me in welcoming Professor Safatle. I'm just going to turn this around so you can see the audience a little bit.
The right title is Negative Dialectics and the Restoration of Infinite. And I would like to start with a quotation of Dialectics of Enlightenment that I know that you know. The adventures of which Odysseus emerges victorious are all dangerous seductions that divert the self from the path of its logic. The self always gives in to each new seduction, experiences it as an incorrigible learner, and even sometimes driven by foolish curiosity, just as an actor relentlessly experiences his roles. But where there is danger, salvation also grows. The knowledge in which his identity consists and enables him to survive takes his substance from the experience of all that is multiple, deflecting, dissolving, and the wise survival is at the same time one who exposes himself most boldly to the trap of death, in which he becomes hard and strong for life. Okay, Adorno and Horkheimer words about Ulysses could serve as a basis for a general epistemological consideration of the Adornian dialectic itself. For until the end, dialectics will be for Adorno a way for thought to divert the self from the trajectory of its logic, in the sense of breaking the idealism proper to a certain projective nature of the relationship with the world. A break experienced as a confrontation with the danger of self-dissolution by questioning the egoic capacity for synthesis and organization of experience. But where there is danger, so does salvation grows. It's a most poetic way to remember that, I quote Adorno, knowledge begins only where it welcomes what to traditional thought appear as opaque, impenetrable, mere individuation. Therefore, the risk posed by dialectics will in fact be the cunning of the survival's thinking that has exposed itself to the seduction of multiplicity and non-identicalness, of the survival excited by the desire to be another like a tireless actor. Thus dialectics could appear as the thinking of who stubbornly gives in to each new seduction, gives in to every charm of the heterogeneous. It is with this movement in mind that we must understand the Adornian statement, and I quote Adorno, dialectics means neither a mere procedure of the spirit, whereby it avoids the compulsion of his object. In Hegel, it literally produced the opposite, the permanent confrontation of the object with its own concept, nor a worldview, a Weltanschauung, in whose scheme could force the reality. Just as dialectics does not lend itself to an isolated definition, neither does to provide any. It is the unflappable effort to combine reason's critical awareness of itself with the critical experience of objects. Okay, neither method nor worldview, but immanence between reason's critical awareness of itself and the critical experience of objects. This immanence indicates a peculiar realism proper to the dialectic that Adorno seeks to account in speaking of it as the effort to determine the movement of thought as a movement of things themselves. Dialectics, say Adorno, is both a method of thought but also something else, namely a determined structure of things. This is his way of giving in to each new seduction, pushing thought to hear the determined structure of things. Therefore, in order to such immanence to be possible, we must move from a correspondentialist conception of realism and respond to the condition for the refusal of any projective notion of thought, even if Hegel comes to speak at certain moments of correspondence between concept and object. If we are not talking about a correspondence in the realistic sense of the word, it is because the immanence proper to the dialectic is realized only on the condition of a collapse of the binding and determining structures derived from the self. Such structures must collapse because they are the expression of what Hegel understands by finitude, which presupposes that philosophical experience itself becomes the field within which such finitude and its principal expression, namely the self, as the foundation of identity and the foundation of the binding principles that constitute objects, all that are dissolved in favor of process that remove from them all illusion of ontological reducibility. For dialectics holds the understanding that finitude is the central ideological fetish of our time. It is the central operator of the constitution of the general regimes of social objectivity. This means that categorizations in the form of representation, of the jurisdiction of boundaries, the reducibility of individualities, the attributive determination of classes, the stable permanence of identities through their predications, are not only a way of thinking, but are also the structure of a way of life, which, with consequences that extend to the fields of language, desire, and labor. This finitude is a form of exile of time in the figure of a linear succession and with no historical resonance. Exile of subjectivity in the figure of individuality seeking the recognition of their properties and their determined place of speech. Exile of desire in general forms of incompleteness, restriction, and lack. Such exiles will all be abandoned in a movement whose result will not only be the dissolution of all attributive pretensions of thought, pretensions of thought. It will be the presentation of a process of transformation that turns its force against the central ideological foundation of our time in order to unify social criticism and critic of reason, and to surpass the implicit metaphysics to withstand the immanent limits of social forms of life in capitalism. Against this ideological foundation of an era that is fundamentally ours, the dialectic sought to be a reflection on the modes of presentation of infinity, with the overall resizing of the field of experience that such a presentation presupposes. Adorno clearly understands the political appeal of the concept of infinity when he claims, quote Adorno, the experience of post-Kantian German idealism reacted against bourgeois obtuseness and satisfaction with the compartmentalization of life and organized knowledge within the division of labor. The term infinity, which, unlike Kant, it flowed easily from the features of all of them, assuming its specific color only in relation to what was for them the deprivation produced by the finitude, by the stubborn interest and stubborn particularization of knowledge in which self-interest is mirrored. That is, in order to prevent the transformation of its own skepticism into a mere strategy of perpetuating thinking at its point of exile in relation to all experience with a pretense of truth, dialectics must name the process that specifies it as infinity in act. Dialectic must understand the collapse of the experience of thought not merely as a failure, but as the necessary moment of a categorical metamorphosis. Even the experience of death, the most fundamental of the operators of finitude given us by Christian theology, will have a completely different and strange function, for example, in Hegel, for it will appear as a phenomenological transfiguration of negativity in relation to finite determinations. Therefore, in Hegel, death never kills. Therefore, in Hegel, no one dies. Not even terror kills. There is a subversion of death in Hegel. For everything happens as we were in a story of multiple incarnations, in which the character never completely disappeared, but returned transfigured, incorporated into other bodies. For death in Hegel reconfigures the field of possible experience in a movement driven by the actualization of infinity. And incorporation here is a decisive notion, for all dialectics will be guided by the refusal of transcendent infinity, characterized by the protocols of inaccessibility, which requires a metamorphosis in the dimension of sensitivity, a clear refusal of what Hegel understands as the subjectivist psychology with its way of understanding transcendental aesthetics as submitted to the determination procedures derived from the knowing subject in its constituent dimension. And it is in this collapse of transcendental aesthetic that the immanence between thinking and movement of things can be established. Well, it may seem counterintuitive at first that such a constitutive relationship to the presentation of infinity rolls true even from the negative dialectic. Contrary to certain commentators, like, for example, there is a famous contemporary text of Terry Pinker that tried to say the opposite. As if the comprehension of infinity in act were a central and inseparable strategy for the resizing of the potentialities of criticism in its strength, at the same time, in a strength that is at the same time destituent and establishing. But let us begin with the uniqueness of dialectical strategy. For one of the fundamental characteristics of dialectic will be found in the statement that it is necessarily in the form of the unveiling of the real contradictions that infinity can be realized. It means that are a strong connection between infinity and contradiction. That is, the contradiction is not merely an indication of normative justice of phenomena in relation to their own concept, nor an indication of an empty object devoid of concept. Contradiction is a description of a process within which self-denial is a form of self-realization. Realization of a self which thereafter will have an infinitely dynamic relationship with itself, and thus breaks with the strictly distinction between the spheres of subjectivity and objectivity, making the modes of connection derived from the synthetic unit of the self enter into collapsing due to the force of negativity. Well, let us accept the definition that infinity within the dialectical tradition does not describe what is infinitely large or infinitely small, what is beyond measure, what stands beyond the unreachable, what is thought in the form of infinite progression. Rather, it describes forms of self-relationship that are immediately self-negations and self-determinations, or even forms of self-relations whose process of determination are self-negations. As we see in Hegel's statements, as I quote the knowledge of spirit, infinity, or this absolute restlessness of the pure moving itself, that cause everything that is determined in any way, for example, as being, to be the other way around of this determination. In the sense, when he later asserts that dialectic, when Adorno later asserts that dialectic is the consequent consciousness of non-identity, he will seem to be doing nothing but providing a contemporary repetition of the Hegelian definition of dialectic as, I quote Hegel, the spirit of organized contradiction. Like the Hegelian spirit which seeks to organize contradiction, the consequent Adornian consciousness would not seek to transform the irreducibility of experience to the adequatio norm into a blockade of thought, but a motor of renewed experience. However, there is still something more. For this non-identity will be the same expression of the process that moves the identifying thought to come across a principle of infinization of its object. Therefore, far from a disappointing strategy, the consequent awareness of non-identity allows the subject to take its substance from the experience of all that is multiple, that deviates the soul, as we saw in the first quotation of this conference. But we are talking we are talking about non-identity rather than difference, it is because we should insist on the procedural dimension of thought. There is a process that must go through the fire of resistance to identity, so that determinations that insidiously remain natural representations can be burned one by one. For the force of reification and the grammar of finitude is far greater than we would like to believe. It runs through every pore of experience. It returns when we least expect it. The intricacies of its resilience are cunning. Such intricacies are countered by the internal explosion of their grammar, and this is the quintessential dialectical strategy. Well, however, we could say that there is something wrong with this dialectical strategy. It's sufficient to remember, let's remember, for example, how, for Adorno, the very notion of contradiction must be understood as the non-identical in the aspect of identity. For it seems that we are in a self-imposed limitation, in which the only access to difference is from an identity always criticized, but never eliminated from the horizon of thought. This is a little bit, well, the type of criticism that Deleuze have done against Hegel in, for example, difference and repetition. No? Adorno anticipated such criticism that will be constant in recent decades, for which the dialectic, I quote Adorno, indiscriminately reduce everything that falls in its mill to the merely logical form of contradiction, leaving aside the full multiplicity of the non-contradictory, the simply diverse. Thus, we seem doomed to always measure the heterogeneous from the thought of unity, which is never, in fact, abandoned, even if denied. Well, however, Adorno operates a double justification. The first states that it's not for tough to ignore. The first justification states that tough cannot ignore what is a real law, that is, what is given by the social reality in capitalism and its dynamics of reproduction. The forms of unity and identity are not forms of thought. They are real forms against which our desires, our bodies, our activities, our speech are struck, in the sense of fundamental forms for the process of material reproduction of capitalist society. To imagine that thought could immediately thematize the difference, anticipating the form of freedom that does not exist already in the present situation, would be an attack on the productivity of effective freedom, which has no measure in relation to the mutilated life to which we are subjected. In this sense, if difference appears as non-identity and mailing as contradiction, it is because within capitalist society, the only way for difference to be felt is as a radical logical impossibility. It is in this sense that we should understand statements such as, and I quote Adorno, anyone who submits to dialectical discipline has to pay without question a bitter sacrifice in terms of the qualitative multiplicity of experience. The impoverishment of experience provoked by dialectic, impoverishment that scandalizes reasonable and sensible opinions, reveals itself in the administered world as adequate to its abstract monotony. What is painful about dialectics is the pain in relation to this world, raised to the scope of the concept. Knowledge needs to join it if it no longer wants to degrade concreteness at the level of ideology. What is really starting to happen? Okay, that is, well, a way to thematize about the fate of contradiction. Well, that is, Adorno don't thematize the fate of contradiction beyond capitalism. He tacitly acknowledged the possibility of, I quote, for the first time, coming from the plurality of the diverse over which dialectics would no longer have any power. But Adorno insists that the only way to leave this world is to elevate the force of revolt against its abstract monotony to the impossible, against its axiological administration. The bitter sacrifice of multiplicity is nothing other than the radicalization of the awareness that in all dimensions of existence, in its deepest folds, the abstraction of the circulation of capital is present. Its totalization leaves nothing untouched. It remains to stand at the point of logical non-existence in order to make this world crumble. It should also be noted that we could counter-argue through a certain anthropological research to difference, no? Anthropological use of difference, that is, by somehow thematizing an outside of capitalism through an anthropological view. For if the extensive use of contradiction is linked, among others, to the conditions of material reproduction under capitalism, to the need to bring difference to the condition of logical impossibility in face of the actual loss of our social life, then nothing would prevent us from appealing to experience of the difference present in non-capitalist social forms that unfolded in historical process still with the reach of the anthropological gaze. Well, 2 points can be made in this regard. First, the appeal of such experience as anthropological horizon of criticism requires that they also be posed as a logical impossibility to our forms of life. If only they are not to be the expression of immanent potentialities of capitalist social forms. Adorno does not claim that the only possible form of difference is contradiction, but that difference tends to be a contradiction in our horizon of experience, which is somewhat something different. No? It needs to be this way so as not to integrate. It must be in the form of the impossible so as not to be reduced to an immanent possibility of our present situation. No? Second point, for the dialectic, the transformation of social forms and social modes of production could only be extensively taught under the regime of articulation between contradiction, crisis, and emergence. Although it is also possible to think of a process of contradictions and crisis without emergence, but with simple destruction or undefined paralysis. It is true that dialectic was in solidarity in the 19th century with the belief in static social forms. For example, you know that Hegel understands societies such as China, India, and Africa as societies outside historical dynamics, which means societies without immanent contradiction and which therefore needs external intervention to get moving. Marx still presupposes distinction between dynamic and static social forms. Speaking, for example, of the nomadic societies of Asia and America, he states, I quote Marx, "The only obstacle that a community can encounter in its relationship with the natural condition of production, with the land, as its condition is, or the land, is another community, which has already claimed it and as its inorganic body. It means only war modifies such societies, and they are principle of staticity. As with war comes conquest, servitude, and slavery. Only in this outward form is the simple construction negatively determined. Similarly, for example, Indian society, regardless of its political transformation, would have its social condition unchanged from remote antiquity to the 19th century, creating, as I quote Marx, a stagnant and vegetative life. Okay, what led Marx to see in the crimes of English colonialism a dubious, unconscious instrument of history, which through the destruction of the old social foundations would break the numbness of Hindustan toward an effective revolution. Once again, the idea arises that only through external intervention would such societies come into motion. Such statements clash with the notion that modes of production have internal limits, which does not mean that they have a production limit of goods and wealth. In fact, it means that they are marked by historical transience because of their immanent contradictory development and the production of dynamics that lead to the emergence of new social forms. Okay, then I will try to finish that. If dialectic in the 19th century still seems to fall back on the recovery of the phantom of static societies, Adorno's and Horkheimer's positions marks a significant break. And just remember the meaning of the first two chapters of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. In them, Adorno and Horkheimer take contradiction to the heart of the relationship between myth and enlightenment, which is the way of eliminate the notion of static societies once and for all, create a certain historical continuity that allows the mobilization of dialectical categories of conflict and contradiction beyond the narrow horizon of capitalism. What some commentators, like Hornet, for example, understood as the undue submission of the critic of political economy to a critical of instrumental rationality was in fact a way to remove the colonial and ethnocentric trace from dialectic, meeting the dynamics of social transformation on a temporal and geographical horizon distended and bringing into modern reason the traces of mythical thought. This process is articulated in two ways. For example, myth and magic still admitted, I quote Adorno, distinctions whose traces have disappeared even from linguistic form. The multiple affinities between beings will be repressed after that by the modern reason, by the only distinction between the sensitive subject and the meaningless object proper to modern rationality. But already its logic of sacrifice in myth, in magic, with its substitution dynamics, is a trait of a representation of the genre and of the indifference of the exemplary that carries the contradiction elements that will make magic become reason. This is the way the Frankfurt School say that the possibility of anthropological use of difference could not provide a horizon in which the possibility of domination that will result in the structure of modern reason would be ruled out. Myth and science intervene at a constant risk of eliminating the social experience of difference. This is the way that Adorno Horkheimer produced a decolonization turn in dialectics. If you allow me, it will not only be by chance to see how this constant risk of intervention that caused within the core's original societies to push the possible emergence of what is contradictory appear, for example, in Pierre Clastres' description of the historical development of the Tupi-Guarani in Society Against the State, this classical book. After arguing for the impossibility of a state genesis from within Amerindian origin societies, Clastres is faced with the complex case of the Tupi-Guarani with its high rate of demographic density and its process of concentrating political power at the head. This foreshadowing of the state, however, produced an upheaval whose effects would destroy the power of the chief. That is, Clastres insists on a clear contradiction to animate such a society that will lead to the discourse of prophets who will organize mad migrations toward the earth without evil in a line of flight out of the imminence of the state. A virulent word that lead the Indians to the destruction of a society, the Amerindians to the destruction of a society in the process of becoming a state. And I quote Clastres. Here is a primitive society that's threatened by the irresistible rise of leadership, is itself crisscrossed and unleashes force capable, even at the price of collective near suicide, of disrupting leadership dynamics, of preventing the movement that could lead to transformations of chiefs into lawbearers and into legislators. Well, at the price of a near suicide, these societies feel the emergence of the regime of a one that leads difference to stand as a contradiction, whose manifestation borders on the dissolution of social form. Let's say, not being more dialectical. Well, it's that. Thank you so much.